Now, I'm not going to do a long rambling introduction, as I often do for Gideon Levy. He doesn't really need an introduction. Haaretz writer, extraordinarily courageous, morally courageous Israeli journalist who has spoken the truth throughout the horrors, not just since 7th of October, but long before then. We've got so much to speak about. Gideon, it's great to see you again. How are you?
Thank you, Warren. It's a great pleasure to be with you again.
I just want to start, actually, since it's been a while since we spoke. And in that time, you could forgive, well, is that the right word? You could see why the Israeli state is in a state of triumphalism, that it will brush aside the likes of me and you who will rage against the horror, the outrage, the criminality of its behavior. But look at the landscape, its enemies in chaos, in collapse, and feel a sense of vindication and triumphalism. What do you think about that? That kind of, that, I mean, is that a fair assessment of where they're at? I would say, but and how much is that hubris or accurate?
It's a very good point, because after the fall of Assad in Syria, the point you raise now is even much stronger, because all of a sudden Israel and Netanyahu and the right winger can present a whole row of achievements when they show Hamas was beaten, Hezbollah was beaten, now Syria is beaten, Iran is the next one, Iran is much weaker already by now, all the wars were justified. It is a challenge, but first of all, we are in a certain stage in time in which things are really not so clear. You know, what seems now as a big achievement can turn into a terrible catastrophe very soon. Secondly, even if there are achievements, none of them justify the price. None of them justify the violation of morality, of international law. None of them justify the barbarism in Gaza. None of them, by all means. And therefore, even if people think that now people like me should learn the lesson and draw the conclusions, no, there are no conclusions to draw. What was a crime until 1 year ago is still a crime, and what is barbarism is still barbarism, and 1,000 babies under the age of 1 year are a crime which nobody can justify, even if Israel achieved I don't know what. And therefore, I stand solid in the same place.
Since we spoke, we've had the International Criminal Court finally issue arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and his former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant for war crimes and crimes against humanity. There's reasons to believe those charges will extend, and they may well go on to apply to other Israeli figures. They may not be public. There's no compulsion. There's no necessity for the ICC to publicly declare those arrest warrants. I mean, they could have done that with Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. They could have done that privately if they so chose. What do you think the significance of that has been? I mean, in terms of the response from the Israeli state, do you think that's indicative of, you know, in terms of this has consequences as far as they see it, in terms of Israeli impunity? Has it made any difference domestically? What's your thoughts?
No, there are no immediate consequences. Israel, like Israel, reacted with a clear blame at the International Criminal Court as an anti-Semitic organ. Donald Trump is around the corner threatening that he will not let it happen, and he might be capable of really destroying the International Court, the International Criminal Court. So Israel is still in its point, but it has an effect. Not an immediate one, not a totally declared one, but it has an effect. When the Israeli Prime Minister cannot go anywhere except of United States and maybe Micronesia, then Israel has a problem. And it starts to penetrate. It's also much broader than this, because there were some rumors that any soldier is now called back. If you were any soldier who was documented in Gaza and went abroad might face charges in many countries now, and they even, according to what was published here, some of them were really called home immediately. This is a process. It's not a one day that people will realize that we did terrible things. It will take some time, but it is starting, and I feel it, because this sense of we are the most moral army in the world became already a joke. Nobody in Israel believes in it anymore. It will take some more time. It will take some more measures until Israelis will understand that only blaming the world does not lead them to the truth. And the truth is that instead of blaming the world, they should look upon themselves and look what we have done in this year in Gaza before we blame the whole world and Hamas and the ICC and the EU and everyone, yeah? But it will take time, but I can clearly feel a beginning of a change.
That's interesting. And that's new, I have to say, when we've had these conversations. I mean, you mentioned there the number of Palestinian babies in Gaza who've been killed, which is around the same number of total Israeli civilians who were killed on the 7th of October. Best part of 1,000 babies killed. We don't know the exact number.
Under 1 year old, under 1 year. Because babies can be also 2 years and 3 years. We are speaking about babies under 1 year. Imagine yourself.
Infants. What you just said there made me think of an article in the newspaper you write for, Haaretz, which was written by Yasmin Levy. And it was headlined, "In a rare break from self-censorship, Israelis got to watch Gaza horrors on their screens." A CNN report from Gaza played on Israel's Channel 13 showed starving women being crushed by desperate masses. But in Israel, people are still shocked by ethnic cleansing accusations. And Yasmin Levy, I guess, was exploring what you were talking about there, which was, I mean, she goes on to say basically, well, look, Israeli television has kept all this off air, not because of censorship, voluntarily, but she said that's catering to an audience, and Israeli, the courageous Israelis like you and her, but people can use the internet, I guess. What you said there was you can detect a change, though. Is that example where we saw some horror in Gaza actually on an Israeli television screen, extremely rare for those who don't watch Israeli television? You normally don't see people suffering on Israeli television in Gaza. It's normally buildings being blown up and so on. Is there do you think people is there a sense of, amongst people who acquiesced or even enthusiastic, is there actually, what is the change?
First of all, it's the beginning of a change. It will not be felt in what Israel is doing. I don't think that Israel is more careful now in Gaza. By all means, not. And we shouldn't have any illusions that this is a short process. It's a very long process because we are facing an enormous challenge. Not only brainwash of decades, but also the 7th of October. And for the Israelis, the 7th of October is an excuse for anything. Still, anything justifies vis-a-vis the 7th of October. Therefore, I wouldn't be too optimistic, but you can feel the first signs. And I always knew that it will take some time. First, the first reaction is always blaming the other, like babies, by the way. If a child falls down, he immediately blames the parents or anyone who is around him. First, we'll blame the whole world. Then we will say it's all lies. Then we will say that it's exaggerated. Then we say that Yemen is worse and Sudan is worse. But finally, they will have to face the truth, if they want it or not, because it is in their face by the whole world now. And if the ICC will continue, which is also questionable, how far will they go? Then I think the total victimization of Israel will change gradually and only by part of the population, not by all Israelis, no way. But at least by those who were part of the peace camp until the 7th of October, at least they will realize that something horrible happened in Gaza and we take responsibility for this. We are responsible for it. Not only happened, but still happening by the time we are talking now. Only today there were dozens killed in Gaza, and every day dozens are killed in Gaza without any purpose, nothing.
What you said there reminded me of what the Palestinian-Canadian lawyer Diana Boutu said. She's based in Haifa. She said that nothing, as far as the narrative goes, nothing justifies the 7th of October, but anything can be justified by the 7th of October. I mean, that's the mentality you're talking about.
Absolutely, absolutely. Israelis feel, first of all, they have no interest in Palestine, in Gaza, in Palestinians, in humanity, in anything, because they feel they are the victims and the only victims. Secondly, they think that Israel has the right to defend itself. And by the framework of defending itself, they think that everything is self-defense. Killing 1,000 infants is self-defense, sure. Do you know any other way to self-defend yourself, if not by killing babies who were just born, or women, or children, or civilians, or anyone? So therefore, I say the challenge is so big. The Israeli media is betraying its mission so much. So you really need to work very hard and to be very patient. But I truly believe that the change will come, because you see the first cracks now.
On that, I mean, the Hebrew version of Haaretz, your newspaper, published a testimony of an Israeli soldier named Hayem Hazahav, who served in Gaza. And he wrote, and I'll quote, "A human life in the Gaza Strip is worth less than the lives of the thousands of stray dogs that roam the area looking for food. While there is a clear order prohibiting shooting dogs unless a soldier is in real danger, when the dog's jaws are locked on him, humans are permitted to be shot without any real restrictions, except for the personal moral boundaries of the soldier holding the weapon." So he's setting out there that Israeli engagement policy is that a civilian life is worth less than a stray dog.
So here it is important to know also who is writing it. And Chaim Arzav is not a political figure, not a leftist, total mainstream. He works in one of the Israeli TV channels as a producer, as an editor. Not very well known, not well known at all, I guess. But you have to take his word, because he was there. Unlikely all the deniers, he was there. Now, he wrote it in a very low-key way, which also gave it a lot of strength. He didn't give any adjectives. He just described what he and his fellow soldiers are doing on a daily basis in Gaza. He was there for 85 days. He knows. Again, it was published only in Haaretz. It didn't didn't carry any attention, public attention, unfortunately. I wrote the other day that this text should be taught in any high school and in any army unit in Israel. If Israel would have been really a democratic country which wants to follow the international law. But that's not the case. But again, that's another sign of first cracks, because to deny Chaim Arzav is impossible. He was there. It's not me who hates Israel, as they say, and is a self-hating Jew and everything. That's an ordinary soldier who writes his memories. And that's enough for any normal situation. But Israel is not in a normal situation, and therefore it's not enough. But it's a beginning.
He says in it, anyone who wants to kill Arabs because they're Arabs will indeed kill Arabs, and no one will ask him questions, interrogate him, or punish him. And basically his analysis was, you know, whether you live or die if you're a Palestinian civilian depends on the whims of whoever happens to be holding the gun at that time. And he notes an invisible line drawn across Gaza separating the north and the south. And Palestinians can only work out where that line is when they're shot dead the moments before they're killed. And then they're classed as terrorists. I mean, I guess that goes to show what he was alluding to is the official statistics of terrorists killed. He's saying, well, these are often, who knows? He says maybe it's In one case, it's a Hamas militant looking for intelligence. In another, it's just a civilian looking for their possessions at home, crossing a line they don't even know exists. So, I guess it shows how terrorist is used as a classification. He really debunks.
And he's a real mainstreamer. This must be emphasized. Really a mainstreamer who never wrote anything. I don't remember him ever expressing himself about peace and war and occupation and apartheid. Never. Maybe he did, but I never heard him talking about it. And therefore it was so powerful. The next day, we had a huge piece, which I think was translated into English, I hope at least, of an Israeli historian who collected thousands of evidences of war crimes. It's the biggest archive of war crimes. Again, a mainstream historian from the university. So you see, day by day, it's a very Sisyphic process, but I still believe that finally Israelis will have no other choice but to admit, but it will take more time, at least those with conscience. There are those who are the Arab haters, the racists, they will never, whatever. If Israel will open extermination camps, they will say, they will justify it, find some justification. I mean, there is this part of Israeli society which shall never see anything wrong in what Israel is doing. But there are people with conscience in Israel who were just very brainwashed and very hurted from the 7th of October, and they think, unfortunately, that the 7th of October gives them the right both to ignore the crimes and to justify them.
It's interesting, that historian you mentioned, just so everyone knows, is Lee Mordecai, who I've interviewed actually on this channel. He's a very courageous, very somber, very, very calm voice, who's very clinically, and I say this in a positive way, drawn together a whole archive of war crimes which have been committed. It's an invaluable piece of work that he's put together. I do want to ask you about Haaretz, because I keep citing Haaretz, and the government is taking action against Haaretz, and that's to do with basically money, which is all Israeli newspapers, it's common in other countries, through advertisements and so on from public bodies, the government. That's an important part of revenue, particularly when advertising revenue generally is in crisis. Can you just tell me as much as you can, I guess, what's going on there and what it signifies about the atmosphere in Israel at the moment?
So we had our adored, at least by me, adored publisher, who said in a Haaretz conference in London that the Palestinian so-called terrorists are freedom fighters. And this had blown a fire which was mainly among Haaretz readers. There were many subscribers who canceled their subscription. And, Haaretz is not very strong economically. It's very fragile. I mean, newspapers all over are very fragile, but Haaretz for sure is very fragile. Doesn't have a lot of reservoir, both in terms of money, but it's not only about money, it's also about, being heard, being read. And then the government used this, cynically obviously, used this opportunity to get this resolution in the government, which I'm not sure it's legal at all. It's being checked yet, that the government will not subscribe on Haaretz. Imagine yourself, all the Israeli ministers, politicians, bureaucrats, soldiers will not read Haaretz. I don't know how many of them are reading it, but and it's not an order. I mean, they can read it, but I don't know to scale it in economical terms. I know there is also a wave now of reaction. I got it by myself, few emails by people who decided now I subscribe on Haaretz because Haaretz goes through this persecution. So I hope it will somehow balance it. Haaretz went through so many challenges throughout the years. I hope it will overcome also this challenge, but it never faced a challenge by the government in a very clear way and brutal way. And this was never the case. I'm in Haaretz for 40 years, over 40 years, and I never remember such a situation in which the government is declaring war on a newspaper. But that's part of the strategy of the government. They don't do it only against us. They do it against anyone who dares to raise their voice. They are having now a campaign against the public broadcast authority, which they might also destroy.
I mean, linked to that, I mean, obviously Israel's self-description is often the only democracy in the Middle East, and disregarding for a moment, obviously, the occupation of the Palestinians, which is a despotism. And there's no consent there, so that itself, that's a pretty big disqualifier. But Ofer Kasif, who is a Jewish Israeli, the one Jewish Israeli parliamentarian who's consistently spoken out about the horror in Gaza. I'm interviewing him this week, actually. But there's action being taken against him. There's a new election law being introduced to try and prevent people like him and Palestinian Israelis being elected. I don't know if you could just briefly explain again about that and what that represents.
Look, it's in all fronts. This government declared now an official war against all the democratic institutions, all the gatekeepers. One of them is obviously the media. Other one is those who raise their voice in the parliament. But when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian members of parliament, what we call the Israeli Arabs, here it has also another hidden goal, because the left will never be able to have a majority without the Arab voters. They are 20% of the voters in Israel. And they want now to do whatever possible, and they will succeed, to exclude them from the Israeli democracy. I mean, you cannot get closer to apartheid than this. They will find all kinds of covers. For example, the law that they are now working on, which will take the right to be a member of parliament if you ever expressed any kind of support, privately, publicly, to any kind of terror organization. Now imagine yourself, I mean, which Palestinian didn't say something about the right to struggle, to resist the occupation? That's the ABC of any freedom fighter. You have to challenge and resist the occupation. And by the way, according to the international law, you have the right to do so, even in violence. So anyone who will express something like this will not be able to be elected to the parliament. So you can imagine yourself what Israel will it be and what parliament will it be. Not that we are very far away from there, but now it becomes officially. And maybe this at least will portray Israel to the world. Because even now, what you quoted, the only democracy in the Middle East, which was mentioned quite seriously until recently, I don't think any serious person would use it now when all those legislations are going on. I mean, it is really a very sad joke, but nothing but a joke to say, even without the occupation, not speaking about the fact that what kind of democracy is it when 5 million people have no rights whatsoever. I never heard about such a democracy.
I mean, you mentioned there the 20% of the population, the Palestinian population of Israel. Do you have concerns about the direction of travel there? I mean, even years ago, this was a Pew Research, a think tank based in Washington, and they did face-to-face interviews with Israelis, Jewish Israelis, Palestinian Israelis, but they found that half of the Jewish respondents at the time, this is back 2014, 2015, thought that Arabs should be expelled or transferred from Israel. So this was long before what we've seen in the last year or so. And Israel Katz, the current foreign minister, defense minister, he was foreign minister, he's now defense minister, replaced Yoav Gallant. He said in May 2022, he said about Palestinians waving Palestinian flags. Yesterday, I warned the Arab students who are flying Palestine flags at universities. Remember 48, remember our independence war and your Nakba. Don't stretch the rope too much. If you don't calm down, we'll teach you a lesson that won't be forgotten. What do you say? I mean, you hear that, and I've just cited, this is before 7th of October. But do you worry about that direction in terms of now, particularly the election law, which is just looking to disenfranchise that population, where the direction things are heading with that population?
Whatever you describe was tripled after the 7th of October, was intense in a way that you can't imagine yourself. It's not only about declarations. Many of our taxi drivers are Israeli Palestinians. For your viewers and listeners, just to explain, I guess all of them know, but still, they are the Palestinians who live under the occupation, the military occupation, and 20% of the citizens of Israel are also Palestinians, and they're supposed to have equal rights like any other Israeli. Many taxi drivers are Palestinians. And recently in Israel, you order your taxi through apps. And it gives you always the name of the driver who is coming to collect you. And you can't believe how many Israelis wouldn't order a taxi if the name is an Arab name. It's on a daily basis. They claim that I don't know how many, at least half of the people wouldn't drive with an Arab taxi driver. This worries me much more than the excitement of the politicians, because this shows that it is already on the ground. People who used to go to do shoppings in the Israeli-Palestinian villages and towns don't dare now, are afraid to go there, even though the Israeli Arab population in this war was paralyzed out of fear, didn't say a word, for sure didn't demonstrate, didn't do any terror, obviously, but people are scared and people are hating, and this division is very hard to repair. But yes, I'm very worried of it. I mean, you wouldn't like to be a young student in Israeli university if you are Palestinian. You would like to be. You would like to be a young student with an Arab accent who tries to get an apartment to rent in Tel Aviv. You will find it almost impossible. And this will explode one day. I mean, even my vision, my dream about a one-state solution, this damage is irreversible or might become irreversible.
With Syria, we mentioned that briefly before. I'm interested to know what you think. You'd sum up the kind of dominant, hegemonic Israeli establishment view on this. In that, do you think it's reasonable to say that actually there was more comfort with the status quo, which was a fatally weakened Assad, rather than what we have now, which is up for grabs, I guess, potentially from the perspective of Israel? And what do you think about the significance of the Israeli invasion, which was used to justify defending the Golan Heights, which of course is illegally occupied territory, which actually belongs to Syria? But what's your thoughts on that? I mean, what do you think the kind of general Israeli view is on the establishment level, at the top, I guess, and in terms of what happens next and the significance of what is an invasion?
So I just finished a short time ago my piece for tomorrow, dealing exactly with this. Look, on one hand, Israelis are very happy that we take this advantage to destroy the Syrian army, so there will be no danger. Now, nobody knows where is Syria aiming to. there are some signs which leave room for some kind of optimism. The behavior of the rebels in the first 2 days is rather impressive. It's not Iraq when they destroyed everything and killed everyone. They seem, at least until this moment, they seem much more responsible than this. When Syria is on its knees, bleeding and traumatized from all those years of this tough dictatorship, and feels that they are breathing some new air, and there are many Syrians who feel so, to go and to bomb, to go and to conquer territory. I'm not speaking about this arrogance of violating the sovereignty of Syria, for God's sake. This is not Gaza, that's a sovereign state. What justification does Israel have now to conquer parts of Syria? It really reminds me of those birds, eagles, and others who would smell blood and death and come and eat the bodies of dead animals when they are on the ground, helpless. That's the way Israel is dealing now. Now, I don't say maybe the rebels will turn into an Al-Qaeda, an Islamist, terrible, dangerous regime, terrible for Syria and terrible for Israel. And then what Israel had done until now, at least in terms of destroying the weapons, might turn out clever, I'm not sure. But not to give it a chance. Maybe this regime wants to open a new chapter. Maybe they look for a different Syria. Give them a chance. Offer your hand. What do you have to lose by this? They will say no, okay, no. Yes, there is the question of the Golan Heights, which is still occupied, even though Israel had annexed it and the United States had recognized it, Donald Trump, we should say. But still, we have to think, I mean, how hated can Israel become if every time that something happens in an Arab country, Israel will come and bomb and conquer without any provocation? In this case, there's no provocation even. There's no 7th of October in the Golan Heights. How are we planning to stay in this part of the world with so much hatred, justified hatred toward us? Those Syrians who are trying now to build something, what will they feel toward Israel? And really, can we live in this neighborhood with so much hatred that part of it is on our blame, like now with Syria?
One thing is I just want to ask you about, I mean, someone might go, I don't know, how much does this matter? But it's about Benjamin Netanyahu, who became, I would say, quite a useful bogeyman for lots of people. You know, people could pretend all the horrors were down to Benjamin Netanyahu and just ignore the pronouncements of opposition leaders. But I mean, it is interesting, isn't it, in terms of him, that after 7th of October, he was seen as the walking dead, politically speaking, because clearly this had happened on his watch. And yet now, I mean, he's flying high, isn't he? If there was an election, he'd win, wouldn't he?
Most probably. It's not so guaranteed, but he has a good chance, which is by itself amazing. I mean, I can't think in any other country about a politician who is responsible. I'm not speaking about the corruption and the charges and the trial, which by itself should bring to his resign. I mean, what does it mean that he goes now every day, 6 hours a day to court for at least half a year now, while Israel is in war? I mean, how will this work? But someone who is responsible to this fiasco of the 7th of October, how can he still be popular in Israel? And the answer is quite complex. It has a lot to do with his personality and his appeal to the lower classes in Israel. He continues to present the oppressed ones, Jewish oppressed ones. He continued to present in their mind their own oppression, because he presents himself now as a victim of the system, victim of the deep state, victim of everything, of the legal system, of the media. Everyone hates him, everyone is trying to destroy him, and people identify with him. And he's a great rhetoric, as you know, and quite an impressive man. And yes, it's and still it's not a full explanation. But what is important for me to stress is that, and this should be repeated again and again outside, please don't get wrong, don't be wrong. If Netanyahu will step down one way or the other, the alternative will be better, but not when it comes to questions of apartheid, occupation, war, crimes of war. Remember this, because I see already the disappointment. They all support what's going on in Gaza. There is not a single meaningful statesman in Israel who feel that what Israel is doing in Gaza is criminal. Not single one. So things will be better, but not much better when he will be replaced. And therefore, I'm not part of this campaign. Just let us get rid of Netanyahu, the demon, and after him, Israel will turn into this paradise. No, it won't.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about was Donald Trump. We're almost exactly at the midpoint between him winning the election and the inauguration. He's stuffed his team full of zealots, including Christian fundamentalists who, and it's very interesting because the most uncritically pro-Israel section of the American population are evangelical Christians, very unlike Jewish Americans who 40% of Jewish Americans under 45 think Israel's committing genocide, which is not the case with Christian evangelicals. What do you think? Firstly, just with Gaza, I'm just interested. I'll ask you about the West Bank afterwards, but firstly, just Gaza. What do you think will happen there? Because there's some conflicting signs. There's some of he wants a win in a sense of he can say, he wants things to be wrapped up. At the moment, Israel is just blowing things up on an apocalyptic wasteland, things with no military value, slaughtering people, as has happened from the start, but with clearly no military purpose of any description. It's just a slaughterhouse. What do you think? I mean, then the other is him posting, woe betide what Gaza if you don't release the hostages. What's your sense of what he's likely, do you think, to do and what Israel's calculating Trump will let them do in Gaza?
First of all, I'm not sure he knows where Gaza is, and for sure has no clue what's going on there. And the first question is, will he decide over Gaza or his team? Because his team makes the biggest racist in Israel to look like liberals. This is really a bunch of crazy people, but really crazy people. His ambassador to Israel, I mean, he went to the Joseph tomb in the middle of the night with the settlers, things that only the most lunatic settlers would dare to do, and all kinds of things like this. I believe that he will be the one who will decide. And for him, it seems there is one goal now, to put an end to the war, because that's a headache for him. He doesn't want all this. And here comes the one and only advantage of Donald Trump. Benjamin Netanyahu is scared of him. Unlikely Biden, who Netanyahu totally ignored. Unlikely Donald Trump, who Netanyahu totally ignored, and rightly so, because they did nothing. They only talked and helped Israel like no one else. Donald Trump is someone that Netanyahu has and will have to listen. He will not be able to ignore him. And if Donald Trump will want this war to end, and I must remind you that this war will end only when Israel will withdraw from the Gaza Strip, which is totally unacceptable on Netanyahu. But if Donald Trump will want it, it will happen. And therefore, Netanyahu is very, very nervous and careful about what to expect. On the other hand, you might expect that Donald Trump, who has no interest whatsoever in international law, human rights, minorities, Palestinians, occupation, apartheid, nothing of this vocabulary talks to him at all. He might just say, do whatever you want. Annexate the West Bank. You said we'll return to the West Bank. Stay in Gaza if it makes you more secure. Might also be the case. So time will show. I think my guess is that he will put an end to the war in Gaza, but not much more than this. It will be the deal. The deal will be go out of Gaza and then annexate the West Bank.
I mean, that's something I was interested in, that because that's the argument I made after he was elected. It would be the quid pro quo: stop the Gaza stuff, annex the West Bank. I mean, people have raised this, but people knew I was speaking to you, and they were really keen for your thoughts on that. You've spent a lot of time in the West Bank. You've done a lot of work there. Right. I mean, some might say, if we're going to frame this properly, that in terms of the annexation of the West Bank, which has been, the dream partly of a greater Israel, that's obviously the first big part of that greater Israel project. They go, well, it's already de facto annexed anyway. And actually, could this rebound on Israel? Because if you annex it, you can't claim there's no way of not pretending it's not an apartheid state. You then have 3 million Palestinian people who are living without citizenship in Israel, and Israel can't grant citizenship on its own terms to those 3 million Palestinians, because then that is a massive demographic threat to the state of Israel as it's currently configured. So how does that work? Because part of me thinks they're not that stupid, unfortunately. These people are not stupid. They're extremely clever people. And it seems to me that, there's an attempt to terrorize the Palestinian population, make life completely unbearable there. So many of them will flee, or maybe Gaza, not quite in terms of obliterating the West Bank, presumably, but, that they can't allow the Palestinian population to remain there if they annex it. What do you think will happen there in terms of an annexation and what that means for the Palestinian population?
Throughout the years and still now, unlikely many others, I'm not threatened by the idea of annexation, because the West Bank was annexed a long time ago. Go and see. The Green Line is dead, totally dead. There is nothing remains of being not annexed. The Israeli law, anyhow, is practiced in the West Bank. The apartheid is there with annexation, without it. When there are two villages and one village where Jews are living, they have all the rights, including the right to elect to the parliament and to be elected. And the next village, the neighboring village, has no rights and no resources. This is the case for decades. Not only this, it's not temporary anymore. For many years, we claimed this is occupation, but occupation is by definition a temporary phenomenon by the international law. You cannot call, after 50 years, you cannot call it military occupation. It is already apartheid. So the annexation doesn't frighten me, because in any case, I have the feeling that the occupation is irreversible. Israel will never withdraw from the West Bank, and Israel will never evacuate the settlers. And if this is the case, let's get out of the closet. Let's come out and say, now we annexate and we are an apartheid state. Officially, according to our law, according to the declaration of the state, we define ourselves as an apartheid state. And then we'll see how will the West continue to see Israel as the big darling of the West. What will be the dream to transfer the Palestinians will never succeed. Not only because they will always stick to the land, not only because for decades this was the Zionist dream and it never worked ever since the first Nakba, but there is also nowhere to send them. Nobody will accept them. Look now in Gaza. Egypt says no. If it would depend on Israel, 2 million would have been already in the Sinai Desert. But Egypt says no, and Israel cannot make a war against Egypt now. So it's not a realistic plan. Not to speak about the moral and legal part of it, but it's not realistic. Where will you send 3 million people? Jordan will not open up to them. So I think that we will get into a real apartheid state with all the problems of it, and then it will depend on the international community. Will it treat the second apartheid state as it treated the first apartheid state, South Africa? And then it might be good news. Or Israel will continue to be hugged by the world, by the West, supplied with all the arms and money and support and diplomatic support and immunity and Israel will continue as an official apartheid state. But for me, the annexation is not something that threatens me, not at all.
I think it's actually a very wise assessment, to be honest.
Thank you.
Just very finally, I normally try and end on a kind of hopeful note, but actually you kind of started there. You gave a bit of hope early on, so we've dealt with that. This isn't a hopeful question. I'm not quite sure actually how to frame it. It's just something that's on my mind, basically. And let's just see your response, because you're definitely the person who I'd want to run this by. You know, you're as far from Gaza now. I'm in central London. You're as far from Gaza as I am from, for those familiar with Britain, Reading, Chelmsford, Southend-on-Sea, places which are extremely close in my mind. You know, they're culturally, you know, these are commuter towns. These are people commute to London every single day from these places. And I can't think of any example in history where you have this tiny strip of land, Gaza, the size of East London, for those who don't know. I think people often aren't aware of just how small Gaza is, which is this apocalyptic wasteland raised from the face of the earth, a different color and texture now when looked at from space, with most buildings destroyed or damaged severely, starving, people eating animal gruel in order to live, but people starving to death, the healthcare system gone. Basically, the apocalypse. I think if people had to kind of imagine the apocalypse, Gaza, I think, is a pretty good approximation. And yet, hell. And yet, nearby, people are eating at sushi restaurants. They're going to clubs. They're partying. They're getting drunk. They're going to cinemas. They're going to festivals. They're going for walks. You know, they're going to work, doing mundane jobs or not mundane jobs, whatever. You know, they're living the life of a European. They're living the life of people just outside my window. I can't think of any example in history, actually, of that extreme, you know, to just those alternate realities. And I guess maybe it does link back to what you were saying at the beginning. Maybe that is about, because I don't quite know what the question is, but I think about it a lot. And I wonder what you think. Do you think about that a lot? And do you think that actually something has to give? Because, I mean, there is something particularly unique about that horror. I just want to know what your thoughts are.
Yeah. First of all, I still remember the service taxi who went every hour from Tel Aviv to Gaza. It costed 10 shekels, like £2, and it took like 1 hour drive from Jaffa to Gaza. 1 hour, 1 hour and 15 for many, many years. People went there for the shopping. People went there for repairing their cars, treating their teeth. If you ask me about one place on earth that I would like to be now, it would be Gaza. Because my heart is invested there. For years, I went there at least once a week for years and years. And I love this piece of land. I know I can't tell it to Israelis because they think I'm out of my mind. But Gaza is so much different than the West Bank, where I still travel at least once a week. Gaza is something else. And the people of Gaza are different. They live by the beach. They are more open-minded. They have sense of humor. And above all, they suffered much more than the West Bank throughout the years. And they are much more courageous. And there is something in the atmosphere. I mean, only people who know Gaza will understand what I'm talking about. Now, it is 1 hour away from here. I remember times that I used to come back from there and I was paralyzed at least for one day. I couldn't go out because also crossing the border with Gaza in times that it was possible was a trauma, a shock, because you move from one world to the other, also in better times, not only now when it's everything really like hell, like apocalypse, but also in former times. It was very hard for me to come back from Gaza and to go out to a restaurant in Tel Aviv. It was really hard. Unfortunately, we get used to everything, and Israelis have a lot of agents who make it easier for them, and above all, obviously, the Israeli media, which voluntarily doesn't show them Gaza. And when you don't see it, it doesn't exist. So Gaza is not in their mind. Gaza is not in the Israeli discourse. Gaza is just a big camp of terrorists that should be killed until the last baby there. This is the Israeli mindset right now. And nobody cares what's going on there. And for me, I feel more lonely than ever in even caring about Gaza because I don't have even common language with my friends to speak about Gaza. So very few of them care about Gaza now. So very few of them are exposed to what's going on there. And really, I think that history will not forget. History will not forget. I hate to compare with the Shoah, with the Holocaust, because it's always a wrong, morally and factually, it's a wrong comparison. But I must remind you that also in the Holocaust, next to those extermination camps, there was normal life. Dachau was a concentration camp, and next to Dachau, I was there once. There was ordinary life, including this wonderful film about the family of the commander of Dachau, who had his normal life, or the commander of other camps, who had their ordinary.
Auschwitz-Birkenau. Yeah,
Yeah,
Auschwitz-Birkenau.
Auschwitz-Birkenau, exactly. Hess, Rudolf Hess, who was the commander and continue his life, and you could hear the noise. Also, Tel Aviv hears the noise of Gaza if it wants, but it's not ready to hear, and the heart is not open to absorb. And it tells only on the level of blindness. It tells only about the moral profile of Israel today. It really lost it. It lost any humanity. This indifference to what's going on in Gaza is unforgivable. Nothing to compare to all the other phenomena that we know from the West Bank, from Lebanon. But this ignorance, this ignoring of Gaza in the Israeli mindset is something that will accompany us many, many years. A big, heavy shadow on our moral profile. To be so indifferent to the suffer which is made by us 1 hour away from our homes, this should be unforgivable. And it is unforgivable.
Amen. And you know what? I always find it very moving speaking to you, Gideon. I hope you don't mind me saying so. But these videos that I do with you and other people do videos like this with you as well, because it's not easy to speak out in the way that you do in the climate that exists. But actually, there will be a change and there will be a reckoning. And these are what you're doing as a testimony. You're testifying to the future, and people will listen back and they'll know that there were isolated people with more courage and consistency who spoke out when it was hard to do so. And I think people obviously will be, as people often should be in terms of Britain, the great terrible crimes that Britain has committed all over the world, including just next to an island. You know, reckonings are forced upon us, but they will, I think, in the ages to come, what you said will be remembered in a very different light than it is currently in Israeli society. But already, of course, all over the world, people clearly
I will not witness it. I will not witness it, but maybe you're right. I'm more skeptical, but maybe one day, yeah.
There's always hope. It's
Yes.
such an honor to speak to you. For all those who've watched, as ever, please share the video, press like, subscribe, leave comments. Good for the algorithm. More people then listen to Gideon. That's the point of the exercise. But Gideon, honestly, it is always an immense pleasure to speak to you. As I said, your moral authority is second to none, and it's great to speak to you with all your wisdom and insight. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, really, Owen. It's always pleasure. I don't want to say pleasure, but
Yeah, I know what you mean.
always,
Yeah.
you know what I mean.
I know what you mean.
All the
Pleasure,
best.
whatever the right
Exactly.
word is.
Pleasure is not the word. Exactly.
Yeah, good job we're not writers. But
Okay.